Welcome to When We Die Talks. I'm your host, Zach Ancell. In this podcast, we explore different beliefs about what happens when we die and how those ideas shape the way we live. Thanks for tuning in. I'm glad you're here. This episode is brought to you by The Dead Book. Okay, let's get real for a second. How prepared are your parents, your siblings, your partner, or even you for the future? We're not talking about the fun stuff, but the hard stuff, end-of-life planning. It's a tough conversation, but that's why The Dead Book exists. The Dead Book makes it easy to plan ahead, even if you think you don't have the time, money, or assets. It's affordable, straightforward, and designed to give you and your loved ones peace of mind. They've made it their mission to help others avoid the chaos and stress that comes with being unprepared. Visit thedeadbook.co and get started today. And just for listening, use the code WWDT at checkout for 15% off. Today's episode features my friend Ryan Williams, who I met at a tea and meditation ceremony at this amazing spot in Portland called Bardo. We clicked right away, and our conversation quickly turned to death and spirituality. Ryan is deeply involved in the local Buddhist community and is one of the most thoughtful people I've had the chance to meet. His background in Buddhism really intrigued me, especially since, even though I don't classify myself as religious, I see religion as an important facet of this project, especially because so much of religion deals with the idea of death. In our conversation, Ryan shares his reflections on mortality, his transition from a Christian upbringing to Buddhism, and how death has been one of his greatest teachers. We explore how meditation and mindfulness have impacted his relationship with mortality and his understanding of life. I think you'll find his perspective both grounding and insightful. And make sure you stay tuned through the end of the episode where Ryan reads a beautiful passage from one of his favorite books as a special bonus. I hope you enjoy. Thanks for coming over.
Yeah, you mentioned death, and I was like, oh yeah, let's chat. Even before I knew you were doing this. It's one of my favorite things to talk about. So,
which is why you're here. So thank you for doing that. Maybe you can talk a little bit about your involvement in the Buddhist community here before we kind of get into it. But I think that might be helpful to give people some context about you a little bit.
Yeah, let's see. So really it started, I was practicing a form of Catholic prayer called centering prayer. And that was a way of me trying to make sense of a lot of inconsistencies in my upbringing, which was we don't need to spend a ton of time on it, but it's pretty wild. In the 60s, there was this thing called the Jesus movement, and a lot of people were doing psychedelics and having like spiritual experiences. I ended up in the 90s in a tradition that was kind of an outflow of that kind of movement that was spurred on from like psychedelics and then people that were having some kind of esoteric experiences. So it was a reactive thing from like theology, and it was more based on personal experiences. So there was a lot of just wild things that I was exposed to from 0 to 10. And then there's just a long line of kind of ebbing and flowing within that community. It was really focused on kind of like supernatural, paranormal stuff.
Interesting.
Yeah. So it's pretty wild. And then I went back into it in my 20s in a way that felt a little more authentic, and then just couldn't fit in it anymore. But knew that I didn't want to just like run away from everything. I wanted to try to integrate the stuff that felt real and sincere for me. So that's how I found myself in this like Catholic centering prayer, which is really basically just meditation, where your meditation object is whatever word brings you back into presence. And whenever your mind kicks in, you just return to that word, and it kind of takes you back into whatever that experience is for you of the presence of God, was kind of the language. And so I had a solo practice for like 2 years. And then I moved here and was really in the beginning processes of the kind of modern term is like deconstructing my faith and then moving into reconstruction. And I ended up moving right next to this Buddhist community. I was already really open to Buddhism because I had a kind of mystical experience that had me basically experiencing this like deep form of contentment, where I realized that a lot of the stuff that I felt like I needed to know, I didn't know anymore, but I didn't feel like I needed to know those things. And when that happened, it just opened me up to a lot of different ways of understanding a lot of these kind of crazy experiences that I had had and the ways that I kind of naturally oriented towards the world. So I did have to work up a little courage to go, but I showed up one Sunday And I was just met with like this intense generosity that I hadn't felt from a spiritual
awesome.
community before. Yeah. So, and then I had been only sitting alone. So the experience of sitting with other people was incredible.
It's definitely a game changer.
Yeah. Sure. It was wonderful. So yeah, that's what kind of got me in the door. I had an experience, I think probably a month or 2 months into actually practicing Buddhist meditation. So I switched my practice from centering prayer to Vipassana meditation. When I did that, I had this experience where I dropped fully into my body, and I realized that I had never really fully been in my body before. It was the first time in my life. And so that was an incredible experience and just kept me kind of going. And once I had that experience, I started being interested in really learning about the tradition and about some of the philosophy before it was just practice. And so then having those two different things of like the philosophy, which we call the Dhamma, which is more than philosophy, but having the Dhamma there integrated with my practice was amazing. And then I would say in the last year or so, I guess it's been a little more than a year, I realized that component of community I was missing. And so I moved more towards that.
Nice. Yeah. I feel like for me, when this journey kind of started, I was having these, I don't even know, like, I wouldn't call them panic attacks, but almost maybe existential attacks.
Of course, yeah.
Thinking about death. And I just naturally was like, meditation seems like the thing to do, but I went straight into like death meditation. And so like, that was very interesting to sit and think about death. And, I can't remember, it's like Maranasati or something. It's like the Buddhist meditation on death. So I feel like I was coming at it a little bit of a different angle, but like, it's interesting how Buddhism does play a huge part.
Are you still doing death contemplation as much? Or?
I'm not doing it as much. I think it made my wife a little uncomfortable, just kind of hearing it a little bit. And so I definitely need to just kind of do, I was doing like guided, but I think after doing, a few of them, at least the ones that I were doing, they're all very similar in terms of like, imagine, you're going to die in 30 years. Yeah. Now imagine 10. Now imagine 1.
Right.
Now imagine 2 weeks, and so I think there's a way to still do that, maybe. Yeah.
Have you heard of the 5 recollections? Are you familiar with this?
No.
Oh, it's beautiful. It's a really simple way, even if you don't want to do a full death contemplation, to like start your meditation. And the first one, I'm going to botch them. So sorry, any pure Buddhists out there that are hearing this, like, oh, you got it wrong. So the first one is I'm going to use my own language for this, but like I'm in the realm of aging. I haven't gone beyond aging. You've heard this?
I have heard this. I actually have a poster of it right next to my, like where I sit.
Okay.
The class that I'm taking right now, one of the requirements is to read those. I did not put 2 and 2 together. I should have remembered, but to read those twice a day. So perfect. I sit in the morning, I sit in the evening, and then I have this little poster next to me. So I basically read it after I sit, morning and night.
Yeah. So I feel like you don't need to go through a full death contemplation. Just hitting those, and then it creates that kind of pocket to sit in.
Yeah, totally.
Which is so nice.
Yeah. But I think, starting to kind of get into death a little bit and into the questions. What is your relationship with death? I think when we met up a couple of weeks ago, you held a little retreat, a little silent meditation retreat. And at the end we were talking, and one of the things that you said that just kind of blew my mind was, and I get it in a way, but I think you maybe meant it in a different way than I took it. What did
I say? What did I say?
But it was that death has been one of your greatest teachers.
Well, I think just because, we started out and just shared my kind of Christian upbringing, but so to give a little context, there was this real fear of death, and it was more than fear. It was like this fight against death from that tribe, where one of the things that we would do is we'd actually go out in public and pray for the sick. And I saw a lot of people healed, like just supernaturally healed. And so there was this theology that like death was kind of the enemy. And I would say that was a deep kind of programming that stayed for a long time until I got into Buddhism and realized that I was really fighting against one of the truest things in my life.
It's going to happen.
It's going to happen to everybody. You know, you could make an argument that there have been some people that have figured out how to kind of transcend, and this is getting into super esoteric, like non-material landscape, but have figured out how to transcend it. But that's very, very few people, if it's ever happened.
Yeah.
So yeah, I could see clearly, at least for me, I'll speak for myself, how that way of orienting towards death was really this inability and unwillingness to really face something that was deeply true. So when that shift happened for me, it wasn't a hard thing for me to do because I felt so much peace about it, because I could clearly see that all I was doing was orienting to something that was already true. I think what was really helpful from the tradition I grew up in is I had a lot of these experiences that were beyond death type experiences. And it wasn't necessarily that they were pre-life. They were mystical experiences that grounded me in something that was kind of a bigger conscious framework to be swimming in than just death. So I think that definitely helped, but to make that transition into like, oh, this is something that just naturally happens. That's kind of the Buddhist framework, is like, look at how life happens. Look at a tree, look at anything that kind of comes into existence eventually ends. It has an end to it. The Ajahn Chah, the father of our tradition, has this really famous saying where he says, the cause of death is birth. Like totally. There's we create all these stories, but the second you're born, you're going to die. So that's your main cause.
Yeah. The clock started.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, that's, and so to really orient towards that was this, it felt like a homecoming, I would say. So that's where the teacher started teaching me, I would say, in a really practical way. And then when I started contemplating it on a deeper level, it created, I would say, a sobriety, like natural sobriety, separate from any drugs and alcohol, but just this awakeness to life, this presence to life. And then it also helped to create this immediacy of what was important and not important in my life. And I didn't have to try to, like, it wasn't something I had to effort. It was like the presence of this reality helped me see so clearly where I was even like placing my time, energy, and resources that I didn't really care about as much. So that's kind of what I mean when I say it's like one of my biggest teachers, is it just helps me really still see what matters and doesn't. My wife and I, we're both really strong-willed individuals, and we don't have a desire to have a relationship where like we don't bring both of our voices to the table. So we're high conflict couples.
Fun.
Yeah, no, I mean, it works for us.
Totally,
It makes certain people uncomfortable, but it's really been helpful to have this even quick thought of like, if I die tomorrow, does this matter?
Yeah.
If she's gone tomorrow, does this matter? Just these certain things, and developing this relationship with it has just been an incredible teacher in those ways. I think a lot of us can relate to this, but I can get really wrapped up in and spin off in distractions that I get to the end of. Okay, a great example is like Instagram. I'm like scrolling, the doom scroll for like an hour, and then I'm like, oh, why did I spend my time doing that?
Yeah.
But I can relate to that in so many different areas of my life. And with really getting a firm grasp on death, it's a really quick way to help me kind of navigate out of that and reorient my own mind to something that I want to really be focused on.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because when you kind of talk about death to most people, or if you're like this podcast, right? If I say I'm talking about death, it's like, oh, that's depressing.
Yeah.
But it really does guide more towards life. I feel like, the more you talk about it, the more you realize how precious this is. And yeah, the little fights and arguments, it's like, is this really worth getting upset over for long term, or like what I'm going to bring to the table versus, hey, you know what, that's actually not that big of a deal.
Yeah. Can I read one of the poems now?
Yeah,
Brought
absolutely.
a couple poems. It's a good segue for the prophet. And I think it's his last one on death. So I'll read this as Kahil Gibran, obviously translated into English. He says, you would know the secret of death, But how shall you find it unless you seek it in the heart of life, like you were talking about? The owls whose night-bound eyes are blind unto the day cannot unveil the mystery of light. If you would indeed behold the spirit of death, open your heart wide into the body of life. For life and death are one, even as the river and the sea are one. In the depth of your hopes and desires lies your silent knowledge of the beyond. And like seeds dreaming beneath the snow, your heart dreams of spring. Trust the dreams, for in them is hidden the gate to eternity. Your fear of death is but the trembling of the shepherd when he stands before the king, whose hand is to be laid upon him in honor. Is the shepherd not joyful beneath his trembling, that he shall wear the mark of the king? Yet is he not more mindful of his trembling. For what is it to die but to stand naked in the wind and melt into the sun? And what is it to cease breathing but to free the breath from its restless tides, that it may rise and expand and seek God and unencumbered? Only when you drink from the river of silence shall you indeed sing. And when you have reached the mountaintop, then you shall begin to climb. And when the earth shall claim your limbs, then you shall truly dance.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's awesome.
Yeah. So, I think, we've been talking about it as this like sobering thing, this kind of like confronting thing. But my experience also has been that once you move through that sobriety and make the connection with life and death, which I don't think you can conceptualize. I don't think it's something that comes through intellectual effort or mental effort, but in this kind of deeper knowing. And there's this sense of joy that comes on the other side of it. But I think that component of like, if it's not leading you into a deeper engagement with life, you're not going to get there.
Yeah.
It's got to take you there first.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
So I think that also is a great segue into
Let's go.
kind of the bigger question.
Yeah.
What do you think happens when we die?
I have no idea. I have some ideas.
Let's hear them.
Yeah. So
I guess the thing that like I should preface, like I'm kind of going into these interviews with people, like thinking people understand where I'm coming from.
Yeah.
The whole idea around this project was, I have this anxiety around death.
Yeah.
And part of that is because, I think, I'm a very analytical mind. And so I think, that side of me says fade to black, game over.
Yeah.
And that's a little scary.
I'll play with that for a second. And then I want to kind of give you a little bit of my history with that question and how it's changed. So my analytical mind, when I like to play with this question, I go into certain ideologies around what's happening on a realm basis. So up to 7 and 9 dimensions of reality. That's really helpful for me because I can understand it on somewhat of an intellectual basis and on an intuitive basis because I've had a lot of different kind of altered experiences. And the first ones were actually completely sober, these kind of like other realmly experiences. So I like playing with that idea that there's like, 7 to 9 different realms. Some people say more, some people say less. And it also lines up with Buddhist cosmology too, where, there's just so many different heaven and hell realms in Buddhist cosmology, but I don't spend a lot of time there anymore. And if I do, it's more play. It's for fun. And it's just intriguing. Like I'll listen to someone talking about it on a drive home to stay awake because it's very stimulating to me and gets kind of my mind going. But there was a time when I really felt like I needed to know the answer to feel okay. And a lot of that was the kind of Christian programming. And so I had this experience that happened when I was 28 or 29. And I kind of just dropped into what I would call the kind of center of my being, was the best way I know how to explain that. And I felt so content. Like I didn't, it was one of those feelings where if I had died in that moment, I wouldn't have cared. It was just total contentment with the life that I had lived, where I was headed. In a lot of different spiritual communities, they would call it this like unification experience, where there was this sense of connectivity to self and everything else. And I just didn't feel like I needed to do anything. The ego was gone. I didn't feel like I needed to be anyone or do anything. And that lasted for like a good little while, like a week or two, before I started the ego started kicking back in. And
the damn ego.
Yeah. But what was really hard and beautiful was I was in a pretty extensive leadership position within a really beautiful Christian tradition. And a lot of that was predicated on me believing certain things about heaven and hell. And there were other values to the community that weren't just based on ideology, but there still was this strong, like, you believe Jesus died for your sins, and that gets you to heaven and not in hell. And I had an experience where I knew that I didn't believe that anymore, but I didn't know what I believed, and I didn't need to know what I believed. So there was this, like, I don't need to understand what's going to happen anymore when I die, but I'm fairly certain it's not this like win-lose scenario where if I do this thing right, then I go to heaven.
Yeah, this is a test.
Yeah, I like in my heart knew that wasn't true.
Yeah.
So that was really challenging. And it was one of the main things. It wasn't the only thing, but it was one of the main things that had me transition out of that community, because I just couldn't be authentic, and authenticity is a huge thing for me. And so, yeah, it was this long, I would say 5+ year process of learning how to transition those relationships. And what was really cool is the pastors of the church I was in, that I was also a pastor, but they knew all of this way before I left. And they weren't like, you need to leave. They actually wanted me to stay.
Interesting.
It was really beautiful. I didn't have a ton of wounds like a lot of Christians do when they have experiences like this and they leave. I was kind of, in many ways, allowed to go through this process because of these beautiful friendships I had with these people. So, and they opened me up to writers like Richard Rohr, who's a kind of Catholic mystic, and really opens up a way of understanding kind of the Christian realm to include other things. And so that's when I started reading mystic Hinduism and Buddhism and everything. So I have them to thank in a lot of ways for making the transition. But what ended up happening was I just got really playful with the afterlife. And I have some other experiences that would take a long time to talk about, so we can maybe talk about them another time.
Yeah, we'll bring you back for another episode.
But yeah, it was this kind of playful way of orienting around it, I would say, until I started practicing Buddhism. And then I developed this like deeper, I would say, like the language we have is the citta. So the heart, the mind that's kind of in the heart, which is the source of our wisdom. It's the source of knowing. And once I started developing a relationship with that, there was just this deep inner knowing that something was happening that was cyclical, in the same way that the whole rest of the universe kind of comes into being and then changes form. And so reincarnation just made sense to me. Not necessarily in the sense that there was, not in the intellectual sense of it, there was something happening with this consciousness that was getting recycled over and over again. And one of the beautiful things that happened was when I started kind of loading that idea. Like, I think of our bodies as like human biocomputers. So we have different programmings, and it's one of the ways that I'm able to kind of like relate to our experience without these like dogmas and frameworks, and play around with it and still be okay. And so when I started loading this idea of multiple lives, the anxiety that I had carried with me for a lot of my life just went away.
Interesting.
Because I'm like, oh, I have, like, what didn't happen is I wasn't like, okay, I don't have to, I can sit back and eat Cheetos and watch TV and not care about anything in life.
This again.
It wasn't that. I mean, if anything, the reality of death pulled me into this sense of urgency in a beautiful way. But what the multiple lives kind of programming did is it helped me kind of be like, okay, I don't have to get to where I think I need to get in my mind before I die. Like, I'm going to have a lot of time, so I can kind of let myself off the hook to a certain extent, and maybe in a certain way. And so it was just really psychologically beneficial for me to start to work with that and orient and kind of move towards that idea. And then the more I've moved towards it, the more I'm just like, that's the only thing that makes sense to me. The other thing that's really cool is in Buddhist cosmology, they talk more about heaven and hell than they do in Christianity. But it's not a permanent thing. It's like you're moving through different realms, and it's really based on your own karma. Karma is looked at very differently. It has much more to do with the intentions behind the actions that you make, and then how you actually personally live in that reality all the time. It's less about you do this and it like goes out and comes back, you know? And so, yeah, the more that I've explored that, and specifically in meditation and contemplation, the more that the truest thing for me is that there's something there with the intentions that we have. And then when we act on those intentions, how it creates this reality, and that reality keeps going even after we die in some way. That it doesn't just kind of come to an abrupt end. It keeps, that motion keeps going. And in many ways kind of determines what happens after. I don't think it's far off that there's other realms other than the 3 planes that we mostly think of. And we could end up in some of those other planes for a certain period of, I guess, time. I don't know. Because time plays an interesting role in all of this too. Like we wouldn't have a fear of death if we didn't have time.
Yeah.
So I think part of death contemplation is also time contemplation, and that can take one to a really beautiful place as well. But
I was going to say, you just added another thing to my list to dig into.
Yeah. Well, I think you eventually get there.
Yeah.
If you pull on this thread enough, like you have to look at your relationship to time.
Yeah.
And I think that's one of the things that death contemplation really does, is it has you show up for time differently. And you can enter into, I think one of the beautiful things, if you really seed it in the right way, is you end up finding yourself in deep time where things kind of slow down and you find this like really rich enjoyment in a way that has nothing to do with external realities. And then you realize how beautiful and beneficial that is, and you want to orient your life in that direction. And so that's been true for me, but I think it's true for a lot of people that pull on this death thread and are able to go through it. Another thing that's really been helpful is, so there's this story in the history of the Buddha and in the early times where these monks focused on these practices that were more oriented around death and kind of the gross parts of they're called the asubha practices. So they would go to like charnel grounds and be with like dead bodies and all these really gross ways to like really get them into that experience. Yeah. Some of them started committing suicide because they just went into a really dark place, like really fast. And so there's this teaching in our tradition that it's really important to brighten the mind along with having these death contemplations, that like practices like metta, like loving kindness. Yeah. It's
been recommended to me a little bit from a couple people.
Yeah. I don't know that it's probably mentally and psychologically healthy to just do asubha practices. That
balance, right?
Yes. Yeah. And I think especially in our culture where there's a lot of baggage around death, it's really wise, I think, to probably start with practices like the Brahma Viharas, which would be appreciative joy, compassion, equanimity, and then loving kindness, metta. Like just working with those and developing an internal kind of like almost growing them like an internal garden.
Yeah.
And finding different, whether it's a guided meditation or just walking and being around things that are really beautiful and growing that in the inner world before you start to go heavy into
go way down,
crazy
way
death
fast.
Contemplation.
Yeah, totally.
But the other thing that's been really freeing for me is, because I think one of the things that happens when you go down this path is you start to realize that there's something that happens when you die in that moment that has an effect on what happens. And so there can be a lot of this anxiety of like, oh no, like what if I'm like looking at porn when I die and then it's going to send me in the, whatever it is.
Totally.
And I'm not saying, I'm just saying that could be someone's
Totally.
anxiety.
Absolutely. Yeah.
But I think that one of the really helpful things is like, it's less about that. And it's more like all the causes and conditions that you put in your life up to that moment affect that moment. It's like this momentum. So if you're spending a ton of time focused on not doing harm and doing a lot of good in the world, that's going to create this momentum that's going to affect whatever happens in that moment. If you're spending a ton of time really looking at death, really looking at your mind, understanding just the nature of reality and what's happening here, it's going to create a lot of clarity in that moment. There's all these ways that you can prepare for that moment. And those preparations will actually be what runs the show at the end of the day, even if you're looking at porn. You know what I mean? That's been really helpful for me. Like, I don't need to figure out how to get this one moment and be so tight around this fear of like, oh, I hope that I'm like, in deep meditation the second that I die and like all this stuff. So that's been helpful as well around just practical things with death. I don't know if am I answering your question? The question was, what do I think about death?
What do you think happens when we die? And I think you nailed that.
Yeah. I think we still have engagement with what's happening on earth now too.
Yeah. I think the thing that I really enjoyed about what you said was, I think, and maybe this isn't the best way of saying it, but in Western culture, we have these like karma and reincarnation. I think we have a skewed view of what we think those mean.
Oh, yeah.
And so, a lot of reincarnation, I think, is, very rudimentary. When we think of it, it's like, oh, yeah, I'm going to come back as, I don't know, a duck or, whatever. And so it was really interesting to hear you actually talk deeply about that. Because, I think when I think of Buddhism, that is one of the things I think about is reincarnation. But you definitely, this is why I wanted you on here, is because you definitely can speak to that more than, just some random person's like, oh yeah, I know about reincarnation. I'm going to come back as this or that or whatever. And in the voicemails, because that's kind of how the project started, almost like maybe not all of them, but a lot of them had ideas around reincarnation. And so I think it's something that resonates with a lot of people. And I think this will be super beneficial for people to understand the Buddhist practice and what that means really versus kind of our skewed perception in Western culture.
Well, I think there's also, for someone that really needs proof, there's just so much out there of really hard evidence on reincarnation. That's like really hard to refute. Like people that have done like really integrous research. And so, I mean, we don't need to go into that, but I think
that's going to be part 2.
Yeah.
When we bring you back, you can, when everybody's like cliffhanger, we need to know more.
You can just go research like how they decide who's the Dalai Lama.
Yeah.
Are you familiar with this?
I mean, I would say again, like very rudimentary, but I do know a little bit about the process.
Yeah, in the Tibetan tradition, like it's integrated in the people that are kind of leading. They literally are born and they're like, oh yeah, they remember being that before,
which is so crazy.
It's wild.
Yeah,
yeah. And I mean, I have a lot of as a Westerner, I have a lot of like initial critiques. Yeah, of like, okay, but really, there's so many different people that remember all this stuff in Western culture too.
Yeah. That's why aspirationally, when I was making a very early list of people to interview, I'm like, okay, top list, top tier, got to get the Dalai Lama. So,
oh my gosh.
Wouldn't that be so rad?
Yeah. He's such a special person.
Seriously. But yeah, so kind of bringing it back around a little bit.
Yeah, let's bring it back.
The last question, I think it's just really important because we never know when it's going to happen. It could be any time. And I'm probably going to repeat this phrasing every time, but I think a lot gets left unsaid with our partners, our parents, our friends, whatever. What do you want them to know? What do you want them to know that you haven't told them, or how they should live their lives or anything like that? I don't know if that's resonating quite right, but
no, I mean, it's something I think about a lot of times because I think about dying a lot. One of the things that I think about is that I really hope that they look into a lot of the things that matter a lot to me when I'm gone. because I spent a whole lot of time like really parsing through what I spent my time and energy on.
Yeah.
So, I think one of the things that when I think about dying, that's one of the things that I feel excited about is it's going to have people kind of leaning into those things more than they would have when I was alive, because it's just what we do as humans. It's interesting. So yeah, I mean, specifically the monastic tradition in general, it's just so important to me. And I'm not just talking about Buddhist monastics, but this we've created in human society this tradition, especially in the monastic traditions, where they live in this dependency with lay communities, where they don't handle money, they don't make their own food, and there's this deep connection to wisdom. And that's become deeply important to me. That's
not how the world works anymore, right?
Well, no, and that's why it's really important.
Yeah.
That's why I'm starting there, is that like
trying to pull
it's
things
not
back
just
there.
an ideology, it's a whole culture that we've sustained somehow for a long time. And it's really beautiful and it's really important. And we've lost connection to elders. We don't really have a pathway for people to become elders right now, and especially in America. But we have this monastic tradition where we have really wise people that are living in a certain way that creates a lot of safety and a lot of purity. And it's the more that we can move towards that and in that direction and around those humans, the better off we'll be. So I think that's important to me, whether you're a Buddhist, whether you're a Christian. There's tons of Catholic monasteries. These are people that are like plumbing the depths of the most beautiful part of our traditions and living it as authentically as they can. And there's bad monasteries for sure.
Totally.
Especially if you go to like a Buddhist country like Thailand, like there's a lot of corruption in those, but there's a lot of really beautiful monasteries, especially in the Thai forest tradition, the Theravada Thai forest tradition, if you're going to a Buddhist country like that. So I would hope that they even would develop a basic understanding of the Dhamma and the Four Noble Truths, because I just think it's such an incredible framework for like leading a really robust life. And then I would hope they would reflect regularly on how much I really care about them. And I would say, just remember that I'm sorry for any mistakes I made and did wrong. And yeah, I mean, one of the things I try to do pretty regularly now is ask for forgiveness when I'm really clear, even like small minor infractions.
Yeah.
And part of that's for me, for sure, because it really affects our well-being when we do that. But it's also like, if I die tomorrow, like I want to be able to have that moment in the flesh with that person.
Yeah. There's not some weird thing hanging over, because
Yeah,
that does happen, right?
I think that goes with you when you die.
Yeah.
I do think that, like unresolved things. And I do think those things can be resolved in the people that are still living. There's definitely ways to do that, but there's
a lot harder that way,
especially in a hyper materialistic society. Yeah. I mean, it's really, there's so many, talking about a human biocomputer, like if you're running the program of like, this is all there is, and there's nothing else, no other realms, no other thing, if that's the program you're running, it's going to be really hard to create that dynamic, because you kind of need that framework a little bit, at least a little bit. You don't even have to believe in it, but just have enough curiosity to kind of move in that direction and be like, I wonder, to be able to have. So I'll share this with you. I spend a lot of time doing breath work, and just for myself and for other people. And that started because I almost died. I almost stopped breathing during COVID, and I freaked me out. I hadn't had asthma issues for a while. So I started doing a daily breathwork practice. And one day I had a really strong cup of coffee, and I went really far into, normally I would just spend like 5 or 10 minutes. And I went about half an hour into my practice, multiple rounds of this, type of breathwork I was doing. And I went into a breath hold, and it was middle of the day. I'm just like sitting lotus on a couch. And I go into this trance, and my grandfather comes through and starts washing my feet. And I've had experiences like this before, not with family members, but kind of mystical experiences. And but this is very different because there was this intense release that happened. We would call it, in the work that I do, a somatic release. I had a profound somatic release, and I was just crying, just sobbing, kind of sitting there still in this trance. There was a release that happened, an emotional release that was extremely purifying, but then there was something given to me. There was a gift given from my grandfather that I didn't even know that I needed from him. It was really profound. And it was what actually got me researching the type of breath work I do now. And because I knew there was something having to do with the breath that was involved in that process. I had what I would call interactions with him post-death, but they were more in like the sense of like, I just felt a nearness, and I felt like he was with me more than I like saw him, just like I'm seeing you, just as real. I mean, the way he was, his affect was different because a lot of the psychological things that he had weren't there. And there was just this pure love from him. Yeah, it was really powerful. So yeah, I've had experiences like that I just can't believe there's nothing after, and there's not some sort of like almost homecoming experience. Like Ram Dass says, death is like taking off a tight shoe. And I mean, that just feels right to me in this like core of my being. And so I don't know how all of it works. I don't think we have the capacity at least in our conceptual framework right now to really understand it. But I think our heart knows it. Yeah. So I think you can have these moments like this if you're open to them. But I think you have to kind of open your heart to them still being there in some sense. And maybe you still rationalize it as it's all happening in my head, because it really is all happening in your head. But yeah, there's probably something more going on there. So
that doesn't mean it's not real though.
Well,
just because it's happening in your head.
That is the real world is the world in your head. Yeah, for sure.
Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah,
I'll definitely include that.
Okay.
And yeah, thank you for coming on the show. This was
Thanks for having
awesome.
me.
I think we'll definitely have more conversations like this.
Cool.
Probably on the podcast and externally as well.
Yeah.
Do you want to let people know how they can find you?
Absolutely. Yeah. So the Instagram will be A Path for the Heart. That's where I'm at on Instagram. And that's probably the best place right now, because I'll find a way to connect to everything else. But
and we can link in the show descriptions to that.
I would also say if you're in Portland, Bloom Breathwork is a great place. It's a kind of collaborative, multi-dimensional breathwork experience that I've created with my friend Murphy and Aaron.
Awesome.
So yeah.
Thank you so much. Thanks for coming.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Thank you so much for joining me on this episode of When We Die Talks. I hope today's conversation sparked some thoughts and helped you feel a little more at ease with the idea of death. Remember, this journey is all about exploring our beliefs and fears together, so I'd love to hear from you. Call our voicemail at 971-328-0864 and share what you think happens when we die. Your thoughts might just be featured on a future episode and could help others on their own journey. Until next time, have a good life.
This poem for me is a really beautiful way, and it's long. So it's a good way to end, but it's also, I feel like, the only way for us to rightly relate to death is to spend a lot of time in solitude. And so this book is called Consolations. It's David White's book on just words and him kind of unpacking words and their meanings. The first word is in the book is alone. So he says, alone. Alone is a word that stands by itself, carrying the austere, solitary beauty of its own meaning, even as it is spoken to another. It is a word that can be felt at the same time as an invitation to depth and as an imminent threat, as in all alone. With its returned echo of abandonment, alone is a word that rings with a strange finality, especially when contained in that haunting aggregate left all alone, as if the state once experienced begins to define and engender its own escapable world. The first step in spending time alone is to admit how afraid of it we are. Being alone is a difficult discipline. A beautiful and difficult sense of being solitary is always the ground from which we step into a contemplative intimacy with the unknown. But the first portal of aloneness is often experienced as a gateway to alienation, grief, and abandonment. To find ourselves alone or to be left alone is an ever-present, fearful, and abiding human potentiality, of which we are often unconsciously and deeply afraid. To be alone for any length of time is to shed an outer skin. The body is inhabited in a different way when we are alone than when we are with others. Alone, we live in our bodies as a question rather than a statement. The permeability of being alone asks us to reimagine ourselves, to become impatient with ourselves, to tire of the same old story, and then slowly, hour by hour, to start to tell the story in a different way. As other parallel ears, ones we were previously unaware of, begin to listen to us more carefully in the silence. For a solitary life to flourish, even if it is only for a few precious hours, aloneness asks us to make a friend of silence. And just as importantly, to inhabit that silence in our own particular way. To find our very own way into our own particular and even virtuoso way of being alone. To inhabit silence in our aloneness is to stop telling the story altogether. To begin with, aloneness always leads to rawness and vulnerability, to a fearful simplicity, to not recognizing and to not knowing, to wish to find any company other than that not knowing, unknown self looking back at us in the silent mirror. One of the elemental dynamics of self-compassion is to understand our deep reluctance to being left to ourselves. Aloneness begins in puzzlement at our own reflection, transists through awkwardness and even ugliness at what we see, and culminates one pointed hour or day in a beautiful, unlooked for surprise at the new complexions beginning to form, the slow knitting together of an inner life now exposed to air and light. To be alone is not necessarily to be absent from the company of others. The radical step is to let ourselves alone, to cease the berating voice that is constantly trying to interpret and force the story from too small and too complicated a perspective. Even in company, a sense of imminent aloneness is a quality that can be cultivated. Aloneness is not a desert or a broad ocean or a quiet mountain. Human beings have the ability to feel the rawest, most intimate forms of aloneness whilst living closely with others or beset by the busyness of the world. They can feel alone around a meeting table, in the happiest, most committed marriage, or abroad a crowded ship with a full complement of crew. The difficulty of being alone may be felt most keenly in the most intimate circumstances, in the darkness of the marriage bed, 1 centimeter and 1,000 miles apart, or in the silence around a tiny crowded kitchen table. But to feel alone in the presence of others is also to understand the singularity of human existence whilst experiencing the deep physical current that binds us to others, whether we want that binding or no. Aloneness can measure togetherness even through a sense of distance. At the beginning of the 21st century, to feel alone or want to be alone is deeply unfashionable. To admit to feeling alone is to reject and betray others, as if they are not good company or do not have entertaining, interesting lives of their own to distract us. And to actually seek to be alone is a radical act. To want to be alone is to refuse a certain kind of conversational hospitality and to turn to another door and another kind of welcome, not necessarily defined by human vocabulary. It may be that time away from a work, an idea of ourselves, or a committed partner is the very essence of appreciation for the other, for the work and for the life of another, to be able to let them alone as we let ourselves alone, to live something that feels like a choice again, to find ourselves alone as a looked-for achievement, not as a state which we have been condemned.